this chapter, we'll begin by introducing the simple regression model. Now, the goal that we have in this chapter is to really explain one variable, y, in terms of another variable, x. And it's important for us to remember that when we are thinking about causality, the direction of causality, we are thinking about x causing y. Or in other words, changes in x causing changes in y. And we really want to estimate what that relationship is. What is the effect of changing x on changes in y? Now, you might think this is really simplistic because we're only talking about two variables here. But this is, even though this type of a concept is not widely used in many applied exercises, we will have one dependent variable and many explanatory variables. However, this is a good starting point for us. So we will introduce the simple linear regression model. We will talk about something that you may have heard of before, the ordinary least squares or OLS estimates. We will talk about the properties of these OLS estimates that can be applied to any sample of data. And then finally, we will close part one of this chapter by talking about units of measurements and how that changes the interpretation that we have of the relationship between y and x, and also changes in functional form and how does that change our interpretation of the relationship between y and x. So for the next few set of chapters that we will cover, I want you to remember that we will be dealing with cross-sectional data sets. You have a good idea of what these are from my previous videos. And remember that we will be conveniently, for now, assuming that the random sampling assumption holds, okay, from the population of interest. So this holds, this is not violated, okay. Now, in the population of interest, remember that there is a big population, and what we do extract from here when we do random sampling is a sample of interest that is going to tell us something about what's going on in the population, okay? So hopefully this is a random sample that we have chosen. That's what we're running with. This is the assumption we're running with. Okay, and we want to understand how y varies with changes in x. There are many examples that that we will be covering and we've covered before, but think about always x causing changes in y, like I said. So here's an example. If x was the number of police officers, then you might want to examine or estimate the effect of the number of police officers on the community crime rate y. Okay. Similarly, you could think about fertilizer and soybean yield, examples that we've taken before, or the effect of education on wages or earnings. So notice the direction of causality here from x to y. Now, before we write down our simple linear regression model, there are a few things we want to remember also from our previous videos. The first thing is how do we allow factors other than x to affect y? So the few examples that we took right now, you might think about crime rates, and you might think, well, maybe unemployment rates cause crime rates to be higher, and not just the number of police officers in the area. Or it could be the level of income, or it could be the age group, or it has something to do with how law is enforced in the area, right? So there could be a bunch of police officers, maybe there's a high degree of corruption in the area. So maybe there are all these factors that could affect y. Now, in the simple linear regression model, while we are thinking about all of these other factors, we're not going to be putting them in the regression. The other thing you might want to think about is what is the functional relationship between y and x. right? So does y vary when x changes, or x squared changes, or 2x changes? Something like that. What is the relationship between y and x, the functional form here? And lastly, how can we capture a ceteris paribus relationship? A ceteris paribus relationship means that we keep all other factors, right? All other factors. If it was crime rates, and we want to estimate the effect of the number of police officers on crime, then we want to keep all these other factors like unemployment rate, income, corruption, all other factors fixed to estimate the causal effect of x on y. Now, when we turn to the simple linear regression model, so we're going to use this abbreviation a lot, SLR. We can think about a simple equation that relates y to x. Here, notice we have different components. We have y on the left-hand side, which is what we're trying to explain, and we have x on the right-hand side, right? So this is y. This could be something like crime rates. And this could be the number of, x could be the number of police officers. Okay, so beta naught and beta 1 are going to be the parameters, and here we are talking about the population parameters of interest. Okay, so maybe we want to estimate this later, okay, and see the effect of x and y. Now, this type of a model is also called a two-variable or a bivariate regression model because this only has two variables, x and y, okay? And you see this other term right here, which captures everything else that we talked about that could potentially affect this thing on the left-hand side, which is crime rates. And if you want to explore more, the term regression actually has some historical roots, and this experiment was done by Sir Francis Galton, and he was basically interested in looking at whether extreme characteristics that are observed in sweet peas carry on to the offspring. And what he found was that it's not so much the case that if there is, let's say, if you have a parent and the parent is really, really tall, then the offspring or the child is also going to be showing those extreme characteristics. Okay, so if you're interested in this, you can read more on this. But there was this idea of the reversion to the mean, and that, you know, when you look at a sample, there's some sort of an average effect that a regression analysis would capture. So it's not exactly relevant here, but I think it's interesting to know. Okay, so remember that when we're thinking about y as a function of x, we are not treating y and x symmetrically, okay? What we want to do is we want to explain y in terms of x, and that gives rise to a bunch of jargon that you might encounter. Some jargon more than others. So when we think about y, which is what we're trying to explain, for example, crime rates, we can call this the dependent variable or the explained variable. These are the two words that are used most commonly to talk about when to discuss y. And when we think about x, because we are trying to explain y in terms of x, x becomes the independent variable or the explanatory variable. It is the variable that explains y, okay? There are some other terms that are also used. For example, y is called the response variable, right? It's responding to something. And x is the control variable, right? It is controlling this effect or this response in y. Y is called the predicted variable because it is being predicted by this predictor variable x, okay? And finally, if x is the regressor, y is the regressand, okay? So regressor is also something we use pretty often, right? And x is also known, if you have a bunch of x's, you can call them covariates, or if you have a single x, you can also call it the covariate, okay? So these are the commonly used terms, so don't get confused. They all mean the same thing, where they are referring to y or x. And remember that the term independent variable for x should not be confused with this notion of statistical independence, okay? That y and x are independent of each other, right? Here we are just talking about it in the regression sense. Okay, and finally, we had this last term in the population, in the simple linear regression model that was talking about what is going on in the population. This term u is called the error term or the disturbance. And this is basically allowing for all the other factors to affect y, okay? And notice here, we are basically saying, by writing out this equation, we're saying the functional form is linear. We're saying that y is assumed to be linearly related to x, okay? And we'll cover this concept a little bit more later, okay? So we're not allowing for a nonlinear relationship, but here we are talking about a linear relationship. And the parameters of interest to us are two. The first one is what we call the constant term in a regression, or commonly known as the intercept parameter, beta naught. So this is this guy right here. And then beta 1 is really capturing, because it's next to x, this is capturing what we are really interested in. So beta 1 is the slope parameter, and both of these together are known as population parameters. So if we had a bunch of other x's in our model, all of those would be population, the coefficients attached to those would be population parameters, right? So the ultimate goal that we have is to estimate these parameters, beta naught and beta 1.